Chapter 6. Time passed in a blur, and even after they'd left the homestead miles behind them, Joseph still heard Miss Hance's screams, felt her collapsing in his arms as she watched her husband die. He'd held her back when she tried to run to Jesse, subdued her when she lashed out at him, wailing that they'd all be damned for what they'd done. Another nail driven into his coffin. He knew the wages of his sins. It was only a matter of time. Earlier that afternoon, he'd ridden out on Hance's land with Marcus and Sal, who decided that half of the $50,000 they'd taken from the bank should be hidden away until they'd thrown the law off their trail. Joseph had led them to the dogwood tree where he'd sat with Dinah yesterday morning, and they'd buried it there. He'd wondered if they'd ever get a chance to come back for it. They'd killed more men today than they had in a month. Posses would scour the prairie for them. Pinkertons would never stop hunting them. They'd spilled too much blood, stolen too much money. "Those gals are going to run straight to the town marshal and blab about us," Remy complained as they neared their campsite southeast of the Hance's homestead. "Should have shot 'em." "I should have shot you for whipping that girl," Marcus growled. Joseph gripped the reins tighter, his blood boiling at the memory. And now she's got no daddy. "I can't believe I'm saying this, but I'm with Remy," Gus said. "We gotta disappear. We can't keep leaving loose ends." Joseph cast him a sideways glance, surprised and disappointed. Gus agreeing with Remy? Losing Elliot's got him on edge. Tony too. Sal looked at them over his shoulder. "We'll be long gone before the law tracks us here." "I hope so." Any posses that might have come from Abilene would have had all day to search, to contact the marshals of surrounding towns. "We gotta get out of Kansas, fast." They found the camp quiet and without a fire. 4 horses grazed under the stars, tails swishing as the tall grasses thrashed in the breeze. They raised their heads, and Rick's dun horse neighed a greeting. "There you are," Rick called as he and Colin walked out of the darkness. "We were starting to think things had gone sideways." "They did," Gus said, never one to beat around the bush. "We got the money, but..." "What?" Colin prompted. Gus swallowed and met his gaze. "We lost Elliot." Rick flinched as if he'd struck him. Joseph didn't think Colin's bearded face could get any whiter, but it did. "What happened?" Rick asked. Joseph dismounted and led Steele toward his tent. He didn't want to hear it, didn't want to talk about it. Watching the life leave Elliot's eyes would haunt him the rest of his days. "Don't wait, Joseph," he'd said. Wait for what? To change? To leave his outlaw ways behind? This gang was the only family he had to fight for. All he had to live for. "Joseph." He turned and saw Marcus striding toward him with his black Morgan in tow. "Hell of a day, huh?" Joseph nodded. "One of the worst I can remember." Marcus stopped and frowned. "What happened to Elliot weren't your fault. You know that, don't you?" Of course he did. That didn't make his death any easier to swallow. Joseph sighed and stared at his boots. Should he keep his thoughts to himself? If he couldn't tell Marcus, he couldn't tell anyone. "It ain't just Elliot," he admitted. He glanced over Marcus's shoulder, took a step closer, and lowered his voice so the others couldn't hear. "Sal didn't have to shoot the teller. He'd already let us into the vault." "The teller slowed us down," Marcus said. "If he hadn't, we might not have lost Elliot." "And Jesse Hance?" Joseph challenged. "He could have killed Donnie." "But he didn't," Joseph argued with building frustration. "How is his family going to make ends meet? How are they going to pay the debt without him working the farm?" Marcus's dark brows furrowed. "What are you saying, Joseph?" He hesitated, figuring how to put it. "I'm saying it don't sit right with me." "Pack up, boys," Sal told the others as they swung down from their saddles. "Where are we going?" Tony asked. "Back to the Strip, to Dead Man's Dune." Lawless and sparsely settled, the neutral strip was just south of Kansas and stretched all the way to the western border of Indian Territory. It didn't belong to any state or any man. Not officially, anyhow. Cattlemen, squatters, and Comanche fought tooth and nail for the areas they laid claim to. Dead Man's Dune was a ghost town the gang had holed up in 6 years ago when Texas Rangers had chased them out of the state. A perfect place to lay low for a while. At least it used to be. Joseph hadn't been back there since. He turned from Marcus, leaving Steele standing by his tent as he ducked inside. No one had breathed a word about Agneto since they'd left Abilene. Didn't Sal care what happened to him? Did any of them? Agneto had stepped between him and the man in the saloon without hesitation. He'd worked hard to provide them with fresh game to eat, to be accepted. He'd shown the gang complete loyalty, and he deserved the same in return. Joseph rose with his bedroll tucked under his arm and pushed through the tent flap. Marcus and Sal had gone to break down their tents. Sal's pitched between theirs. Joseph set the bedroll behind his saddle, and his hands lingered, his fingers curled around the leather straps that bound the wool. Gears grind as his frantic eyes scan the windows for his mother's face. The train chugs away from the station, belching clouds of smoke into the winter air. "Come back," he cries as he runs down the platform, a blaring whistle drowning out his screams. Joseph dropped his bedroll in the grass. I can't abandon him. He took a deep breath and trudged toward Sal with a heavy heart. The journey to Dead Man's Dune would be a perilous one. Sal would need him, and he wouldn't be there to watch his back. Ever since he'd gotten into that fight in Salina, he'd done nothing but disappoint him. "Sal," he said before he could change his mind, "I'm going back for Nieto." Sal had just secured his bedroll behind his saddle, and he turned to him with a frown. "Nieto's dead, son." "Maybe not." "You gotta be kidding, Joseph," Marcus exclaimed, marching over to them. "Riding back into Abilene is suicide." "It ain't the smart thing to do, but it's the right thing." Joseph looked around, all of them staring at him with shocked expressions. "How many times have we stuck our necks out for each other?" Colin sighed. "I don't want him to hang any more than you do, but there's nothing we can do about it." "We kicked a hornet's nest," Rick said. "Posses will be swarming all over these hills." "Rick's right," Tony agreed. "Live to fight another day, Joseph. That's what Nieto would want." "I can't help noticing he ain't here to speak for himself," Joseph grumbled. Gus huffed. "Come on, Joseph. We need you. Don't throw your life away for a fella you barely know, especially not for an Injun." "Nieto is one of us," Sal had said, but the others didn't see him that way. The Ohio boys had joined the gang 8 years ago. They'd been around much longer than Nieto and the Guidry brothers, and because of that, they treated them differently, kept them at arm's length. If Elliot were sitting in a cell in Abilene, Joseph knew they'd be singing a different tune. He looked at Sal, at the bloody mark on his left cheek where Hance's bullet had ripped off his skin, a rare reminder that even he wasn't invincible. "Joseph, if you get caught, I won't be there to get you out," Sal warned him. "I know," Joseph swallowed, wondering if he'd ever see him again. They risked death every time they pulled one of these jobs, but this time felt different. "I'll meet you at Dead Man's Dune." Sal wasn't one for sappy goodbyes, and neither was Joseph, so he walked away without another word, his heart pounding at the thought of going it alone. "Joseph!" Marcus grabbed his arm and spun him around. "Stop and listen for a second, would you?" he growled, his voice just above a whisper. "I know what this is about, and this ain't the way to make amends." A lump stuck in Joseph's throat. He couldn't deny it, so he deflected. "I ain't dead yet, Marcus. If I end up 6 feet under, you can put 'I told you so' on my tombstone." Once everyone else had packed up and gone, Joseph tried to get some rest before he set out for Abilene. He tossed and turned for hours. No fire kept out the cold. No tent shielded him from the wailing wind. With his gloves on, his coat wrapped around him, and his head on his saddle, he lay staring at 2 veins of light flowing like a river through a field of twinkling stars. What would Dinah and her mother do now? They couldn't afford to hire cowhands. Roach would take their ranch. And then what? With her brother gone and her father dead, what lengths would Dinah be driven to? What would poverty reduce her to? Joseph looked at the saddlebags sitting beside him. Marcus had given him his share of the take before he left. $2,500. More money than he'd ever had in his pocket. Much more than he needed. He couldn't right the wrong. He couldn't bring her father back. But if he lived to see another sunrise, he'd do what he could. A sudden clamor of barks and howls made Joseph sit up so fast, his head spun. He grabbed his rifle and put the stock to his shoulder, squinting into the surrounding darkness. Steele raised his head and gazed north, his ears forward and alert. The coyotes cried again. They were a long ways off. Joseph set the Winchester aside, reached into his coat, and pulled out his pocket watch. 1:30. Time to head out. Wearily, he rose and picked up his saddle and blanket. "You know, it's a good thing you can't talk," he said as he hoisted them onto Steele's back. "You'd be telling me what a crazy fool I am for doing this, and you'd be right." The Mustang gave him that same sidelong glance, his big black eyes always seeing straight through him. It both unnerved and comforted him. That strange wisdom horses seemed to have. Joseph rolled up his bed and buckled the leather straps, tucked it under his arm, and slung the saddlebags over his shoulder. He secured them behind his saddle, retrieved his rifle, and pushed it into the scabbard. Once he'd nudged the bit between Steele's stubborn teeth, he stuck his boot in the stirrup and mounted. He looked back at the ashes of the fire that had burned that morning, half expecting to see Elliot sitting on an overturned box and stirring a pot of beans. Instead, he saw an empty campsite, smelt no biscuits, heard no laughter. He'd never been away from the gang before, not like this. It felt wrong, lonely. Just you and me, boy. He pointed Steele east and tapped his sides with his spurs. As the stallion's hooves pounded and the wind rushed in his ears, Joseph couldn't stop thinking about the robbery and what happened at the homestead. Trapped in a miserable cycle of what-ifs and should-haves. Focus, he reminded himself. What's the plan? How are you going to get Nieto out of there? He'd shot 2 lawmen during their escape, and Tony had killed a 3rd. That'll have dealt him a serious blow. They'll be short-handed, especially with more folks out looking for us. Joseph weighed his options, considered several situations and how they could play out, some riskier than others. If he managed to find Nieto without getting caught, could he subdue the guards without firing a shot? Any commotion would bring the wrath of the whole town down on them, and they'd be done for. With no moon to light his path, navigating the steeper slopes proved difficult. Won't be going nowhere if Steele breaks a leg. Joseph slowed his pace. A shiver ran through him, and he sniffed, nose burning and eyes watering as the wind stung them. Movement drew his gaze. He stopped and peered into the darkness. 100 yards to his left, floating lights drifted westward. Lanterns. Joseph ducked his head and tugged his hat farther over his brow, his heart thumping faster. Posse or not, he had no intention of being spotted. Steering well clear of them, he glanced over his shoulder, waiting for shouts to rise above the wind, for hooves to thunder behind him. The lights disappeared over the next hill, and Joseph sighed in relief. Good thing there ain't no moon, after all. The hills flattened as he kept riding east, and he guessed that he was less than 5 miles out from Abilene now. The knot in his chest pulled tighter, his buried fears bubbling to the surface. What if Sal's right? What if Nieto's dead, and I came all this way for nothing? Something moaned in the darkness ahead. Startled, Joseph brought Steele to an abrupt halt. The stallion stood at attention, the wind ruffling his mane and whispering through the grass. You hear that, boy? There it was again. A cry for help. Joseph spurred Steele forward, his hand on his holster as he ventured closer to the road. He shouldn't show himself to anyone, shouldn't risk getting recognized. But a line had hooked somewhere behind his breastbone, reeling him in. Was it guilt, curiosity, a sense of responsibility? Whatever the reason, Joseph couldn't ignore it. A big box-like shape appeared out of the blackness. He leaned forward and squinted. He could just make out 2 wheels turned sideways. A wagon. Joseph circled in front of it and found broken crates littering the ground, their contents scattered in the grass. A stranger lay pinned under the wagon, squirming and struggling. You're in a pretty bad way there, partner, Joseph called. The man froze and looked up at him. Please, help me. I can't move. Joseph feigned indifference. Quite a bind. Please, sir, my leg. Joseph rolled his eyes and sighed, his conscience pestering him like a fly. All right, quit your nagging. He dismounted and approached him, stepping over broken eggs and splintered wood. What are you doing out here so late anyhow? I was just asking for trouble. I might ask you the same, sir. His eyes darted to the farmer's wizened gaze. Does he recognize me? Joseph turned his face away and braced his gloved hands against the underside of the wagon. Get ready to crawl, old man. Teeth clenched and muscles taut, Joseph pushed with all his strength. The wagon shifted, and the stranger wriggled out from underneath. Once his leg had been freed, Joseph let the wagon fall with a heavy thud. The farmer's bearded face twisted as he got to his feet. Balancing on one leg, he clutched his ribs. His bony shoulders stooped with age. He wore a wool cap on his head, his clothes covered in patches. Thank you, he panted. Them that robbed me. They stole my horse, my goods. I was taking these supplies to Abilene, to folk who need 'em. That's real unfortunate, Joseph mumbled, looking down and scuffing his boot in the dirt. If it ain't too much trouble, mister, my cabin's just a couple miles north of here. Can you take me there? He shook his head. Sorry, partner. I ain't got the time. Someone else will come. I know I'm asking a lot, sir, but I'll compensate you, the stranger pleaded. Joseph pinched the bridge of his nose, and pain flashed between his closed eyes. It still hadn't healed from the headbutt he'd taken in the saloon a couple of nights ago. He hissed through his teeth and lowered his hand. Stand up on that crate over there. He pointed, and the man's wrinkled brow creased deeper in confusion. Joseph didn't bother explaining himself. He returned to steel and climbed into the saddle, his limbs stiff with cold and the many miles he'd already ridden that day. Mind your manners now, he muttered, the Mustang's ears flicking back at the sound of his voice. If you buck 'em off, you'll break 'em. Joseph walked the stallion over to the crate where the stranger stood shivering. Leaning to his left, he stuck out his elbow and said, "Get on." The farmer's face brightened. "Oh, thank you, sir. Thank you." He reached up and grasped Joseph's arm with a weathered hand. Joseph braced as the man pulled, and he hauled him up onto Steele's back. The Mustang snorted and tossed his head. "Easy," Joseph warned. He glanced over his shoulder. "You on?" "Yeah," the stranger grunted, letting go of his arm. Joseph started off at a slow and steady pace. "Couple miles north, you said?" "That's right. You got a name, mister?" "Joseph," he answered reluctantly. "A fine name. A strong name. I'm Obadiah. Awful cheerful for a fella who just got robbed. Long way from home, ain't you?" Obadiah remarked. Joseph's eyes narrowed as he stared at the starry horizon. "How do you mean?" "I know a Dixie drawl when I hear one. I was born and raised in Tennessee. Moved out here after the war ended." "A place ain't home just 'cause you're born there," Joseph grumbled. "True," Obadiah sighed. "I didn't know what to do with myself when the fighting stopped. I was angry and restless. Thought I needed a change of scenery, somewhere that weren't so familiar. I traveled 800 miles only to realize that my home had been right beside me all along. It weren't a place. It was my wife." "Is he in the habit of sharing his life story with strangers?" "We'd lived in the same house almost 30 years. She must have reckoned I'd lost my marbles, but she left her family, her town, everything she'd ever known to follow me to Kansas. I don't deserve her, my Martha. You got a woman, Joseph?" His heart sank, and he clenched his jaw. "No." He never had, not for longer than a night. "Why not?" Obadiah's interest seemed genuine, but Joseph's patience was wearing thin. "I ain't the settling type. In my experience, a wandering man's looking for something, searching for a thing he's missing." "I ain't missing nothing but silence," Joseph snapped. "Liar." "If you're planning to pass through Abilene," Obadiah ventured after a pause, "I should tell you that a bank was robbed and there was a big fire on the south side of town." Joseph swallowed. "A gang of outlaws came through yesterday morning and cleaned out the vault. Killed a lot of good men, including the sheriff. Terrible business. Terrible. They caught one of them, locked him up in the calaboose on First Street. The marshal's out looking for the rest." Joseph breathed a quiet exhale. And Yeto's alive. And now he knew right where to find him. Joseph stopped Steele in front of a little log cabin with a garden and a chicken coop. Sheep baaed and bleated in a nearby pen as Obadiah slid down from the stallion's back. "Thank you," he said, eyes crinkling as he smiled up at him. Joseph nodded. Warmth spread through him, the same warmth he'd felt when he saved the Hance's cattle. It felt good, to help instead of harm, to be thanked instead of cursed. "Here." Obadiah reached under the collar of his shirt and pulled out a necklace. A cross dangled from the chain, glimmering in the darkness. "As promised, that there is real silver. My pa wore it many moons ago, and his pa before him." Bitter claws dug into Joseph's heart. Joyful singing fills his ears. The voices of the adults around him rise above his own, the piping organ vibrating his chest. The sweet and acrid smell of the marshes and the spice of star jasmine waft through the church's open doors. His mother looks down at him and smiles. She holds his hand when they leave, the briny breeze of the low country blowing brown curls across her face. Joseph shook his head. He wanted nothing to do with that cross. "I can't accept something like that." "Please," Obadiah insisted, holding out the necklace. His black brows drew together. "It would mean a lot to me." Joseph avoided his gaze. "I ain't no saint. Neither am I. We're all sinners. Some of us trying our best, others doing their worst. Joseph huffed an angry, guilt-ridden cloud into the air and looked at him. He didn't understand why Obadiah wanted him to have it, or how he could so easily part with something that had been in his family for generations. But having no desire to insult or offend the old veteran, he reached down and took the cross from his outstretched hand. "That's seen me through many a battle," Obadiah told him. "It'll never lead you astray." Joseph tucked the necklace in his coat pocket and said, "Take care, Obadiah." He wheeled the Mustang around and galloped southeast toward Abilene. Stars flickered in a pitch-black sky as Joseph rode into the slumbering town, the stillness a far cry from the havoc they'd wreaked yesterday morning. He checked his watch. 4 o'clock. That meant 2 more hours of darkness, more than enough time to get in and out before the sun came up. When he stuffed the watch back into his pocket, the edges of Obadiah's cross poked his gloved fingers. Joseph withdrew his hand as quickly as if the silver had burned him. He'd done a good deed. So what? It was impossible to balance the scales, to ever outweigh the evil he'd done. Joseph stopped Steele at the corner of Cedar and Fir Street. A row of charred skeletons stood across from the jail, wood structures the fire had destroyed. One brick house had survived the blaze. All that for a bag of money. This didn't feel like sticking his thumb in Uncle Sam's eye. These were homes, businesses, everyday people just trying to get by. Joseph walked Steele up to the small plank jail, a livery looming on the other side of it. Quietly, he slid to the ground. A chill ran through him, partly from the cold, partly from nerves. Joseph took a deep breath, curling and uncurling his stiff fingers as he looked up and down the street. Not a soul in sight. Heart thumping, he crept around front, hoping the wind masked the clink of his spurs. A lantern burned near the door, sitting on the ground at the feet of... Joseph's stomach dropped, and he stopped in his tracks. Elliot's body lay in a lidless coffin leaning against the jail, a sign hanging from his neck that read, "You're next." A direct threat to the gang, to every outlaw who still walked free. Every misgiving Joseph had went up in flames. He pulled his bandana over his nose and pressed his back against the wall, drawing his left revolver. He reached out his right hand and rapped on the door. "Who's there?" a male voice called. He sounded young, afraid. Joseph didn't answer. The door swung open, shielding him from sight. "Hello?" The lawman stepped into view, his hand on his holster. "Is someone there?" Joseph lunged. He clamped his glove over the man's mouth and shoved his gun against his temple. "Scream and I'll blow your brains out," he growled. "Nod, if you understand me." Slowly, the man nodded, taking his hand off his holster. Joseph steered him inside and shut the door behind them. He had no trouble controlling him. His hostage was as short as Tony and as skinny as Colin. The jail consisted of a single room with a desk pushed against the far wall and a cell in the back left corner. And Nieto stood up from his cot, eyes wide with surprise. Joseph's relief turned to rage when he saw new bruises on his face, and he holstered his Schofield. He grabbed fistfuls of his captive's green shirt and shoved him against the wall. "Are you the one that beat him?" he demanded. "Please, sir, Are you?" No, I had nothing to do with that, Mr. Honest." "He's telling the truth," Nieto said. Joseph grimaced. He wanted to hit something, needed an excuse to after seeing what the townfolk had done to Elliot. But this fella, he's an overgrown kid. Harmless. Keeping one hand on his shoulder, Joseph relieved him of his weapon. "Quit your sniveling. Ain't you got some pride?" "I ain't no lawman, sir. There weren't no one else to watch him." Joseph pushed him away in disgust. "Open that cell before I lose my temper." The young man's hands shook as he unhooked the keys from his belt. Joseph went over and laid the Colt on the desk. A framed photograph of Wild Bill Hickok hung next to a picture of a mustached man he didn't recognize. Lamplight reflected in the glassy black eye of a pronghorn mounted on the wall beside them. He turned from it as the cell door creaked open. Nieto walked out and gave him a grateful nod. "It's good to see you. I didn't think anyone was coming back for me." "You're one of us," Joseph said. "I don't leave nobody behind." Nieto's eyes brightened. Joseph marched over to the guard and yanked the keys from his clammy fingers. "I have half a mind to put you in one of them pine boxes. Maybe if you keep real quiet till we're gone, I'll let you off easy." He shoved the young man into the cell and locked the door. The new prisoner rushed forward and gripped the bars. Please, sir, don't leave me in here. Consider yourself lucky, Joseph warned, stooping so that he was face to face with him. If you ever spill a drop of Valentin blood, I'll come for you, and our next meeting will end differently. The young man swallowed, white as a sheet. Joseph turned to Agnetto, who'd gone to get his belongings from the corner. You ready? Yeah, Agnetto grunted, putting his bow on his back. Let's get out of here.